Welcome to our course, The Use of Patristic Studies in Engaging Chinese Culture, a medical case study. This is the first lecture, topic 1, the patristic reception of Greco-Roman medicine. Why bother with Chinese medicine? Now, when one visits the Yunnan Hospital of Traditional Chinese Medicine, which is in China, it becomes apparent how pervasive Chinese medicine is in China. For surrounding the hospital are rows of Chinese drugstores, all filled with herbs grown largely in the province. Now, scattered among these shops are Chinese medical clinics, often run by master physicians or what they call Lao Zhongyi, with their attendant long queues of patients. For these Chinese patients and millions others throughout China, the efficacy of traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, is beyond doubt. Now, a similar sentiment is observed worldwide. For over the last 50 years, the use of TCM has grown by leaps and bounds. In Korea, Japan, Singapore, and of course China, Chinese medicine has been incorporated into local healthcare system to varying degrees. Now, in the West, it is now common for patients to consult TCM doctors. Many of these doctors are themselves non-Chinese. Now, the incident that drew the most attention from the news, perhaps, was the 2016 Rio Olympics. The US swim team appeared at the pool with strange polka dots on their backs, and the reporters soon found out that the marks were left by cupping treatment, which was a form of TCM therapy. And to top off TCM success in recent years, the Chinese physician Tu Youyou was awarded a Nobel Prize in 2015. She had discovered the potency of artemisinin for combating malaria, and she did this by combing through the Chinese medical classics. Now, despite such popularity, TCM has had no lack of critics. In Singapore, Andy Ho, a senior writer of the Singapore Straits Times, once criticized the Singapore Medical Council for allowing doctors to refer patients to TCM physicians. Now, as he sees it, this was a setback for evidence-based medicine, since acupuncture, as he puts it, is nothing more than a superstitious therapy, practiced not by the serious Chinese physician, but by shamans and bloodletters. More seriously, TCM was based primarily on the flawed Chinese cosmology and an unproven idea of qi, which supposedly was a luminous force that supposedly animates all life. Now, Andy Ho stirred up a hornet's nest, and so the next few days saw many responses and exchanges from the public, either in support of or criticizing TCM. Now, in Christian circles, a similar debate is observed. But what is at stake here is not just whether TCM is scientific or effective. Instead, the question that burdens Christians is whether TCM has been tainted by Chinese religious ideas. And if yes, can Christians still use TCM? Now, many Western and Asian Christians see TCM as a pseudoscience based upon an ancient, limited, error-filled understanding of anatomy and physiology. More seriously, they fear contact with and use of TCM may expose Christians to unruly Taoist or religious teachings. Neil Anderson and Michael Jacobson, for example, have suggested that Chinese medicine could well be one of the many spiritually counterfeit health paradigms conjured by Satan and his demons. Now, not all Christians think like this, however. Often, the Chinese-speaking Christians are quite happy to use both modern and Chinese medical therapies. In their mind, there's no contradiction between TCM and their faith. In fact, some of them, including pastors, are also TCM physicians and have employed TCM to serve their communities. Now, if there's one thing that Christians throughout the centuries share in common, it is their constant disagreements with their peers on a whole host of subjects. Now, this being the case, why bother to deal with this debate about TCM? Why engage the subject at all? Well, I have 3 reasons for this. The first is apologetics. Now, the non-Christian Chinese community often regards Western Christianity as a Western religion, one that undermines and looks down on Chinese culture, TCM being a significant part of it. If our dismissal of Chinese medicine is not based on robust theological and medical grounds, we then alienate the non-Christian Chinese community and thereby create an unnecessary stumbling block to the gospel. What is at stake, therefore, is the love of our neighbor, that we seek to understand their culture correctly and remove any obstacles to the gospel. Second, if Chinese medicine is a legitimate form of medicine, it is then another viable therapeutic option for Christians. And this can only improve the health and well-being of the Christian community. Thirdly, contextual theology. Now, throughout the history of the church, Christians have found it beneficial to engage with non-Christian sources of wisdom, both as a means of articulating and also contextualizing their faith. Now, it's my hope that as we engage Chinese culture through its medical tradition, we will also develop new ways of articulating the Christian faith, one that is both faithful to the broad Christian tradition, while at the same time also to the cultural sentiments of the Chinese. This is where we come to the potential of patristic studies. Now, interest in Chinese contextual theology has grown rapidly over the last 2 decades. Now, this largely corresponds with the burgeoning growth in the number of Chinese Christians worldwide. And many approaches have been developed for this endeavor. Nevertheless, I believe that patristic studies have a unique contribution to this dialogue. Now, let me explain. When Christianity first came upon the scene, it was largely a Jewish religion. It taught and conceptualized in Jewish terms. It answered Jewish questions about God and human life. Now, things soon changed when Christians began to engage the broader Greco-Roman culture, such as Paul's speech as the Areopagus, where he cited not from the Hebrew scriptures, but from the writings of Greek philosophy. Now, in due course, Greek Christians began to employ Christian teaching to answer Greek questions about the nature of God, creation, human destiny. Now, as for the answers themselves, they were often framed using Greek philosophy, Greek philosophical categories. Now, the concept of God as one ousia and three hypostases is a good example. Now, while it seemed obvious to explore the divine nature using these terms, it is only so because we are trained to conceptualize in ontological terms. As we shall see, the Chinese were never interested in ontology. This subject never featured as a topic in Chinese philosophical discourse until the late 19th century, when China came into contact with the West and had to translate the term ontology. So hypothetically, if Christ was born in China, Trinitarian theology would sound rather different. Now, the Christian reception of Greek culture is, of course, an immense field in patristic studies. This research has yielded many helpful insights on how the two cultures have influenced and transformed one another. Now, during the course of my doctoral studies, it dawned upon me that the methodologies employed, the perspectives derived from this area, can lend themselves very well to Christian dialogue with Chinese culture. Now, like the Greeks, the Chinese developed an extensive philosophical framework, Confucianism and Taoism, for describing their relationships with God, the world, and humanity. Like the Greeks, this philosophical system is compatible with the Christian faith in some areas and contradictory in others. Surely, a familiarity with this Greek Christian dialogue will be of much use in the Chinese dialogue. And this goal will occupy the rest of our talk. That is to think through what the patristic reception of Greek medicine may mean for our engagement with Chinese medicine. I start with some patristic reflections on medicine and healing. Now, when Galen wrote at the beginning of the 3rd century, late antique medicine was still a pluralistic world, with the Hippocratic dogmatists, the empiricists, the Methodists, all vying for dominance against one another. A century later, however, Galenic medicine had gained so much prominence that arguments over the interpretation of Galen would replace disputes over alternatives to Galen. From the onset, most Christians, with the rare exception of Tatian and Pseudo-Macarius, they all took for granted that, number one, secular medicine was a gift of God, and so given for the benefit of humankind. And like their non-Christian peers, the church fathers adopted Galenic medicine as the norm, and they employed it for anthropological reflections by the mid-4th century onwards, as was the case for Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Nemesius, Emesa, and others. Now, in their minds, medical anthropology was largely Platonic and Aristotelian, whereby all human organs were constituted by the 4 humus, which in turn were made up of the 4 elements: air, water, fire, earth. Sicknesses were then due largely to imbalances in one's humus or a deterioration of the elements within this humus. Now, as it appears, the early Christians were not troubled by the fact that Galenic anthropology was based largely on non-Christian philosophy. Now, this, however, did not mean that the fathers were unreflective about their reception of this medical tradition. Rather, if one may gather from Patristic's discussions on this subject, what they were more concerned about was the theological role that secular medicine played in their lives. To begin, even though the fathers concurred with the Greeks that the majority of illnesses had natural causes and were therefore susceptible to medical intervention, they also believed that sicknesses and diseases were, in the first place, the unfortunate consequences of Adam's fall. Sicknesses and death were therefore inevitable and can be gotten rid of only at the general resurrection. Furthermore, the scriptures also bequeathed to the fathers a varied and complex etiological system that went beyond just humoral imbalances. For instance, when one fell ill, it could be due to a wide range of reasons, which you can see in scripture. It could be due to divine punishment, such as you see in Exodus 9 or 2 Kings chapter 5. But the fact that the illnesses were an occasion for a cosmic duel between God and Satan, as it certainly was the case in Job 2, or sicknesses was a covenantal symbol, Genesis chapter 32, or it was a means of ascetic training for the afflicted, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, in such cases, Basil's advice holds true. Healing calls for assiduous prayers rather than a reliance on medical therapy. Now, regardless of whether one was healing naturally or supernaturally, it remained clear to the fathers that God was the ultimate healer of all diseases, and that medicine was but one of his means of healing. Now, besides theological reflections about medicine, the fathers also frequently employed Hippocratic theories and medical therapies, such as surgery, cautery, regimens, and they employed them as helpful analogies for pastoral care and ascetic practice. Now, how so? Well, let me explain. Since the classical period, pagan philosophers have often seen themselves as the physician of the soul. A similar sentiment soon took root among Christians from the 2nd century onwards, and they started to apply the same epithets to Christ, and they exalted him as the great physician, Christus Medicus. By the 4th century, church fathers such as John Chrysostom and Augustine will take for granted that their pastoral work is no less than a form of psychagogy, and that their medical analogies can be helpful means of conceptualizing their pastoral advice. Basil of Caesarea's instruction in his longer rules is a good example of this development. Commenting on the doctrine of humoral, he basically commends the doctrine of humoral balance as a spiritual model for his readers. He explains that just as the flesh must eliminate foreign elements or humus and add whatever is wanting, so also one should remove whatever vice that damages his soul and increase whatever virtue that is befitting him as an image of God. So in this case, the doctrine of humoral balance becomes an analogy for how you should develop yourself spiritually. Later, Basil endorses the medical regimen as a valid ascetic practice, helpful for managing one's passions. The regimen, he explains, prohibits sensual indulgence. It is opposed to satiety. It forbids the inexpedient and elaborate diets and an exaggerated liking for condiments. So any excesses in eating, you should refrain. So the medical regimen, as he sees it, generally regards one as the mother of health, and he sees that it's beneficial for Christians too. So any monk who takes this regimen seriously will reap not only bodily benefits, but also spiritual self-mastery. Now, if the father's experience is instructive, 3 points are clear for our engagement with Chinese medicine. Firstly, there appears to be little religious grounds for Christians to reject naturalistic medicine a priori. Just because a medical tradition is based on a non-Christian philosophy is insufficient reason for disqualifying it. Now, the same, I argue, must be the same for Chinese medicine. Secondly, in the father's teachings about Galenic medicine, there's surprisingly very little discussion on whether Platonic anthropology, that which is assumed in medical tradition, was problematic. Instead, the father's primary concern seems to be the theological role that medicine plays. Now, this concern, I suggest, should also guide Christians when we engage Chinese medicine. Number 3, just as Greek medical theory and therapies can provide helpful analogies for pastoral care and spiritual formation, it is quite likely that the same can happen for Chinese medicine, and we would do well to look out for them. Now, this is because Chinese medical analogies, when used well, will help the Chinese understand better and grasp the Chinese and will help the Chinese better understand and grasp Christian teachings. Now, let me bring this talk to a close. Over the last 20 minutes or so, we examined the different concerns about Chinese medicine and identified 3 reasons why Christians should engage TCM. The first is for the sake of apologetics and evangelism. The second is to consider whether TCM is a legitimate therapeutic option for Christians. And the third is to use this engagement as a means of constructing Chinese contextual theology. We then went on to consider the patristic reception of Greek medicine, and we identified 3 areas of focus. Number 1, the fathers affirmed medicine as a means of divine healing. Number 2, they saw that they had a strong concern for the theological role of medicine. And number 3, they used medical analogies for pastoral discourse. Now, in the second lecture, we shall move on to consider how Greek medical philosophy was shaped by patristic anthropology, and how these 2 anthropologies actually differ from Chinese medical anthropology. Now, thereafter, we shall examine Chinese medical anthropology in detail before drawing some conclusions about Chinese medicine and Christian anthropology.